We'd like to welcome you to the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies. I'm Corey Leonard, and we're pleased that you are with us today. It's our great honor to welcome Carol C. Adelman, Senior Fellow and Director with the Center for Global Prosperity and the Hudson Institute. She will be speaking today on global philanthropy and beyond, reinventing foreign assistance. Not only an important topic, but a very timely one. We couldn't have planned it any better today. We'd like to thank Susan Merrill, who is an adjunct instructor and teaches the International Development minor program at the Kennedy Center, for helping to make today's lecture possible. And I'll turn the time over to her in just a few minutes. Let me first just make a couple of brief announcements. I think most of you know that today's lecture, like most of our lectures, will be video recorded, podcast available on our iTunes channel. What you may not know is you can also access these lectures through BYU's SiriusXM channel. And also, you can follow us on IPTV, which is a secret internet TV channel that we have just discovered. If you're on campus with a hardwired connection, any lecture or event that's going on in the Kennedy Center is broadcast on channel 192. So if you use your IPTV to get access to CNN or ESPN or any of the other IPTV channels, just keep that in mind. That's another option. And for those of you on Twitter, we are live tweeting at the hashtag KennedyLive. Today at 3 o'clock in this room, we'll be pleased to welcome His Excellency Peter Amann, who is the German ambassador to the United States. He'll be speaking on the future of the U.S.-European partnership. Again, that's at 3 o'clock today. At 4 o'clock tomorrow, we'll be welcoming back John Dinkelman, who's the Deputy Chief of Mission with the U.S. Embassy in the Bahamas. And he will be giving his lecture on careers in diplomacy. He has come out every year for a number of years, previously when he was posted as the consul in Nogales, and before that as the Deputy Director of Training at the Foreign Service Institute. Always a great presentation, and for those of you who are thinking about careers in diplomacy or in the Foreign Service, this is a great opportunity to learn a little bit more. Lastly, tomorrow and Friday will be our first Center for the Study of Europe, Europe in a Nutshell conference. We passed out flyers for you. The content and the access to experts on Europe, I think, is unprecedented, and also in a conference that's organized to help inform students, which makes, I think, a little bit unique from some of the events that we've had. In addition to that, if you aren't already enticed to find out if Europe is going to survive, the real catch is for every session you attend, you'll be entered in to win a free study abroad airfare to Europe. So if you were thinking, how am I going to make that trip to London or Spain or Paris work, go attend all the sessions. Every time you attend, you'll be re-entered again. Your chances go up. And we just don't call it gambling. So it's just a nice competition for you to get a chance to win. There will also be other giveaways and opportunities to meet other students and interact with a number of students across campus who are interested in Europe. So that's tomorrow and Friday. Tomorrow the sessions will be held throughout the day at the Hinckley Center, and on Friday in the Moot Courtroom of the J. Reuben Clark Law School. Also tomorrow night's keynote is John Hamra, the president of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. That will be a Kennedy Center Wheatley Institution co-sponsored lecture at 7:30 p.m. So we look forward to seeing you at that. Next week, if I can just jump 1 week ahead, we'll be welcoming Gretchen Morgensen, who's a reporter with the New York Times as part of our New York Times Partnership Series. She'll be speaking on the next global financial crisis, if the breakup of Europe wasn't gloomy enough for you. And remind you that we do make available on Monday through Friday up to 500 free copies of the New York Times. So we hope that you're picking up your paper and you're enjoying the opportunity to stay current. We also have a partnership with the Wall Street Journal, which you can get delivered to your apartment or your residence. There's more announcements, but I'm going to leave it at that. We're getting to that time of the semester when things get very, very busy, but hopefully you know how to find out about all the events that are going on and that you can take advantage of them to expand your world and enhance your education while you're here at BYU. We'd like to begin, as is our custom, with an opening prayer. We've asked Riley Andresen, who's an anthropology major from Albuquerque, New Mexico, to offer that prayer. Then I'll turn the time over to Susan Merrill, who I mentioned is an adjunct instructor with our International Development minor, and she will introduce Mrs. Adelman.
Our dear Father in heaven, we are most grateful that we're able to gather here today and to gain a deeper understanding of the world around us, and we are grateful for our speaker and for the knowledge that she is prepared to share with us. And we're grateful to be here at BYU and to grow in our talents and to grow in understanding, and please bless us with open hearts and open minds, and please help our speaker that she'll be able to communicate all that she has prepared, and we ask these things in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ, amen.
Okay. I wanted to thank you all again for coming today. Dr. Adelman Carroll has had a very long and illustrious career, both in private philanthropy, but also in the U.S. government as a presidential appointee to the U.S. Agency for International Development. As Corey mentioned, she's currently the director of the Center for Global Prosperity at the Hudson Institute, which is a private think tank in Washington, where she lectures, writes, and advises both governments and private corporations on philanthropy, on foreign aid, and on international healthcare issues. Her master's is from Georgetown in International Studies, but she holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins in International Health and did her doctorate on the causes of maternal and child mortality in the barrios in Lima, Peru. So she has both on-the-ground experience as well. From 1971 to 1981, she was a Foreign Service officer living in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, doing global health programs. But in 1988, she became the presidential appointee as assistant administrator at USAID, where she ran foreign aid programs with budgets of over $3 billion in Asia, the Middle East, and when the Berlin Wall fell, opening up Central and Eastern Europe, which was quite a challenge in those economies. Most recently at Hudson, she's been appointed the vice chair of a congressional oversight committee, the HELP Commission, which was established to provide current high-level oversight and evaluation of U.S. foreign aid programs. And this report has been extensively used in actually some of the presidential campaigns and some of the, certainly by the White House. She is an authoritative expert, and I'd like to welcome Carol to our podium.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Corey. I'm very happy to be here because my husband and I have been coming out to the Utah Shakespeare Festival for the last 23 years, bringing our family. I have a brother and a sister-in-law who taught in the Utah public schools, just retired this summer. So, and we have been teaching leadership through the plays of Shakespeare to Overstock.com for the last 5 years. So we love Utah, and in fact, we just came, my husband's on the board of the Utah Shakespeare Festival. Ken, would you raise your hand? He's right there. And he had a board meeting, so we went down and saw the plays and then just drove up here. So thank you for making this a wonderful week for us, and delighted to be here. I also enjoyed working with Susan Merrill, excuse me, at AID when she was doing a big report for the administrator of aid. And I came in to help out with the chapter and with some of the future trends in aid. So we got to know each other there. And she's a person of the highest scholarship, and I really enjoyed the work there. And of course, now I'm getting something in my throat after being fine all day. I began my interest in philanthropy, I think, with my serving overseas with AID and seeing all the NGOs, foundations, less in local foundations, seeing NGOs and foundations there. And so Africa, I worked with missionaries, I worked with NGOs, and would get them involved in helping me with different things that I was doing with government aid. And then when I came back as a presidential appointee for Eastern Europe, it was clear to me that I wanted to do aid in a different manner. I wanted to do it as public-private partnerships. So that was one of the first times in the late 80s that we started the whole public-private partnership movement, even, that is now fairly familiar. And it was an exciting time because, we were trying to help countries who had been caught in the time warp of communism, trying to help them turn on a dime. And it really helped solidify my belief in freedom and free enterprise, but talking to all these people who who had been deprived of this for so long. And Albania was probably one of the most amazing countries. They had, at the time of independence, they had the last Stalinist dictator, Hoxha, right? The time of independence, 200 cars. They were still using ether in the hospital. We landed on the tarmac. There were people were hoeing, and there were goats coming across the tarmac. And so it was a really amazing experience. And I talked to a lot of political prisoners there who were put into jails for 25 years along with their whole families because they had been complaining in a bread line or listening to the voice of America. So it was a time where I talked to people about the value of jobs for their, not only their well-being, but for their dignity and their respect and their human beings. And I was very interested in, I read Governor Romney's speech that he gave at the Clinton Global Initiative just last night. And I'm going to try to incorporate that into some of the statistics and data that I show you, because I was really delighted. He used our numbers from the Global Philanthropy Index that I publish, and I'm glad, because I think this is it. I'm a data person, so I learn from numbers, and what is going on out there in the world, it became clear to me when I started measuring. And one of the reasons I started measuring private giving was because people in the late 90s started calling America stingy. How many of you have heard that phrase before? Just raise your hand. Okay, good. So I'm glad not many of you have, because I was trying to wipe it off the table, the phrase. But the reason they were calling America stingy was because they were basing it on a measurement of our government aid as a percent of the American gross national income. Because our gross national income is so high, we always were on the bottom in terms of government aid as a percent of gross national income. And I said, wait a minute, I've seen all these private actors out there, so I began looking around for, well, how much is going into private aid? And sure enough, nobody was measuring it. So it was actually in this report that I worked on with Susan at AID that I had done some measurement before, but we did the first real efforts at measuring it. What we found was fascinating. We found that it was much higher than government aid. And then when we started doing more than the numbers, started capturing what was going on in these projects, that was even more fascinating. And finding out that more hands-on, measuring results in the sense of what I call outputs, and I know this sounds like a technical term, but it's very important in government projects. And I'm just gonna give you my little quickie on evaluation. There's inputs, outputs, and outcomes, okay? The input is when you send the seed over to Africa through a private assistance program or a government aid program. The output is if that farmer plants the seed and grows it. The outcome is whether that farmer can raise his disposable income by storing it, does he have good storage, transporting it to a market, and getting a decent price, and having a healthy enough life to not need, and having some kind of crop insurance if things go wrong. All the kinds of things that go into that. So I was finding great output measurement by NGOs, and I'm going to show you others today that I think are even doing really good work on the outcomes. Where I think government aid falls down is that they don't do very much at all on the outcomes side, and not even that much on the outputs. But that's for the future. So today, I wanted first just to mention to you before I start a few PowerPoints. This is the Index of Global Philanthropy and Remittances, and we brought you some executive summaries of it. This in 2012 was in the 7th year of publication, and our website is on the back, www.global-prosperity.org, which is, and I'm telling you that because you can download this for free. We don't do any more paper copies of the full thing, but you can download that. And we also have an intern program where we take 3 or 4 times a year, we take three interns too, who are interested in this topic. And you can go on our website and find out if you're interested in looking into that program as well. So today we're going to talk about how the developing world has changed, how philanthropy has changed foreign assistance, and how new forms of financial assistance beyond philanthropy even, are changing how philanthropy is even being done. And then we're going to look at what are the implications of that for what government aid should do, and what we think is working and not working in the field of foreign assistance, whether it's public or private. And as I said, I was really interested in reading Governor Romney's speech, and pleased to see that he was using some of our numbers. So some of these I'm going to get into right now. But before I do that, one of the things he said in his speech was how the developing world has changed. And then he pointed in his speech to the increase in private flows as opposed to public flows. I'm going to get into that later, but right now this is really the most important thing. Because everybody likes to look at the developing world, especially Africa, as a glass half empty. Well, what has happened in the developing world is quite different from that, from all of the data when you dive into it. First of all, there's been an increase in economic growth. Africa, as you know, has been growing at 4.95%, which is actually higher than Latin America and even some other developing countries. Africa comes in after only Asia and the Middle East, and all of those countries come in at 2 times the growth rate of the developed world. And that is helping people catch up to the fact that now some 60% of trade is created through the global GDP is from the developing world. Global savings in the developing world has quadrupled over the last 30 years. Another point is that there's skilled labor out there now because of this growth, creating jobs and creating enterprises. And so the way I like to put it is that the developing world is business ready. There's skilled talent to work with. Another thing is increases when I talk about open societies in freedom. 1990, there were 76 democracies. 2010, there were 116 democracies. In 1972, 29% of countries were listed as free by Freedom House. In 2009, 2010, 46% were listed as free. So we have this change, and it's been going on, and I'm going to show you that in the numbers too. Second big picture point is demographic and social transitions. Emigration has increased, and remittances have increased. And the interesting thing about the developing world and the institutions measuring that aid is that remittances were kind of the lost financial flow. And it turns out that after private investment, they are the second highest flow. And these are remittances from migrants who come to our country here or go to another country and send money back to their hometowns. And the majority of these funds are going into food, clothing, shelter, and into, now it's very interesting, into microfinance projects and into roads and clinics and buildings. So it's a tremendous resource, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. There's also been an increase in the middle class. And I was interested to see Governor Romney talking about a prosperous middle class as an important measure of development. And what we've seen, and what we're seeing now, we're adding another 2 billion. By the end of this decade, 2 billion people will be in the middle class in the developing world. By the year 2030, the estimates are 3.6 billion. And what does this mean? This just means people have money. They are now creating foundations, community foundations, which are the fastest growing foundations in the world. This is happening in the developing world. And so there's more wealth out there. There's also an interesting statistic about billionaires. When Andrew Carnegie really got, his foundation underway in his early 50s or so, when the life expectancy of males was 57 or so, he got the money out there and started using it. Well, our billionaires today, and they're all over the place in China and India, but here in the U.S., Jeff Skoll was about 34 when he started. Bill Gates was 38. So our billionaires are giving out their money at a younger age, and they're giving it out in a longer time. So if you combine all these statistics, it really is, what I hate to use is this phrase, paradigm shift. But I do believe in 10 to 20 years, we will have a paradigm shift in the availability of financial flows, and particularly private, that will be changing the developing world in amazing ways. And then the third is the growth in private philanthropy, remittances, and local charities, which I just talked about. Bottom line, there's major new streams of money that were not there at the time of the post-war period and the Marshall Plan. Hence the reason why we did have the Marshall Plan. I mean, Europe was devastated. There weren't any private, there were a few private NGOs out there, but very little private investment. So we did need the government money. But when people call for a Marshall Plan now, I show them these numbers, and it's kind of apparent that it's not government Marshall Plan money that's needed. You know, it's more from within in the developing countries. Then the final big point, big picture point, is expanded knowledge and demand through technology, and that, as we know, in my era in development, it was radio and TV, and today, of course, it is the internet, it's cell phones. The World Bank, I was at a lecture a while back called The Cell Phone, the Industrial Revolution of the Developing World. The tens of millions of students that study in the developing world that are going back to their countries. The people are just being empowered by information much more now than they were before. So here is kind of if you can remember this chart, and we have this chart in the executive summary, you are going to know it all, and this is going to help you understand what Governor Romney was saying in his speech. And I also have some things to say about what Secretary Clinton said in her talk, too, at the Clinton Global Initiative, which was a new initiative, which is very exciting, which rather dovetails with some things that Governor Romney said, too. I'm going to be blogging about that, but I didn't have time to do that last night, so I'll be doing that later. Okay. What this chart is if you look at the left side of that chart, it's 1991, and it goes up to 2010, okay, on the horizontal axis. And the gold line is all private flows, all right? And that means private investment, remittances, and philanthropy. And that kind of purple line, and this is in your thing if you have trouble seeing this, the purple line is government aid flows from all the developed countries to the developing world. This is everybody. What you have trouble seeing is that those lines crossed back in 1991. And if you were to we don't have good enough data to even put them on a chart, but if you follow those lines out before 1991 all the way back to 1960, they diverge so that the relationship was opposite. Right now, the private flows are $575 billion. Government flows are $128 billion. And 2010 is the latest year for which we have data, so that's the only reason that we have this comparable data, but the trends are staying the same pretty much from everything we follow. So this 575 and the 128 is where, when Governor Romney talks about he talked about it in his talk yesterday, 82% of all financial flows to the developing world from developed countries are private. That is what he is talking about. That's what that number is. And the 18% is $128 billion. So to me, this helps explain why in the most recent World Bank poverty report just showed some amazing data of how in 1981, 52% of individuals in the world were living in extreme poverty, and by 2008, that percentage had gone down to 22%. And even more interesting, the number of people in poverty was halved over this 30-year period, which means that it's already met the Millennium. Do you all study the Millennium Development Goals through the UN? I'm sure. For the reduction of poverty, that means that the developing countries have we've already met the goal of poverty reduction, which was supposed to have happened by 2015. So that was kind of interesting news when that came out. And I contend it's because of what that orange or yellow line is showing us is that's the skilled talent. There's the developing world is business ready. There are people receiving those private funds. They are developing. The economic growth rate is working, okay? So there's a quote that I want to read to you, and I brought this along because we are in the Kennedy Center Forum, or that's in this building, or I guess that's what we are here, right? I want to tell you, read this, something that he wrote in 1963 in April to his message to Congress, and I think it's meaningful. He said, "Both this nation and the countries we help have a stake in their reaching the point of self-sustaining growth, when their economies will have been launched with sufficient momentum to enable them to become self-supporting. The record clearly shows that foreign aid is not an endless or unchanging process." So, I mean, the goal of foreign aid, back when President Kennedy was talking about it, was that foreign aid would be a temporary thing, and countries would advance and progress. And so I think it's important to remember this, because rarely in foreign aid discussions will you ever hear anybody saying, well, foreign aid should end. Because that means that a country has graduated. And we need to remember that that is the ultimate goal of foreign aid. So government aid is now a minority shareholder. The next, I'm going to just show you this real quick. This chart on the left is what I just showed you. Chart on the right just gives a breakdown. The top line is $329 billion over there in 2010, and that's private investment. The next largest flow is remittances at $190 billion. Then comes government aid at $128 billion, and then private philanthropy at $56 billion. So that kind of gives you a rough thing. That big dip you see there on the top line, that was in the 2008 crash. And so that, we can kind of see how the economy goes. What's interesting is how much remittances and global philanthropy are steady flows, basically. Remittances didn't dip very much during the recession, nor did private philanthropy. We had like a 4% decline during 2008 and 2009. Okay, let me go, I'll put that up there, to, this is interesting data here. That's something that you should know. This chart, which is also in your executive summary, is the U.S. private aid to the developing world, okay? And the very top number is U.S. official development assistance, the $30.4 billion, which is what our government aid is. And then that number below is the $39 billion, which is U.S. private philanthropy, okay? And then under U.S. private philanthropy, that's the breakout of how much foundations give, corporations give, private and voluntary organizations, which are groups like CARE and Save the Children. And then volunteerism, what that is worth, universities and colleges through all the scholarships that they give to students from developing countries, and religious organizations at $7.2 billion, a huge amount, which I'm sure is larger, but we actually conducted the first survey of religious giving. And we do have a number for Mormon philanthropy in there too, but again, I think it's probably very underestimated. So I'm hoping to learn more and get some good sources from my trip here so we can get that number correct. Bottom line here is that official development assistance just from the U.S. to the developing world is only 9% of our total economic engagement. Philanthropy is 12%, U.S. remittances are 29%, and U.S. private capital investment is 49%. So the whole language that's even used in terms of assistance, I mean, we've even changed the language that we use by saying total economic engagement rather than government aid or private aid, because it represents so many diverse flows. I want to just say a word about remittances here, the $95.8 billion really quickly. When we first started the index, I got a lot of flack for saying, well, are you saying that you think remittances are philanthropy? And I said, no, if you don't want to call them philanthropy, that's okay with me. But I was in a lot of debate on that. But what they are is a tremendous financial flow that has not been recognized. And what is interesting is now we know more about where they're going. And as I said, they're going into poverty reduction projects, into many of the same, the same kinds of things that government aid and private aid are going into. There's interesting projects now using remittances as loan securitization. A NGO in Washington, D.C. called TechnoServe had a project in El Salvador where just based on what a person in El Salvador had received and they could show in their bank account, the remittances that they were regularly receiving was enough for that person to get a loan to start a small business. And so they were, in fact, developing a lot of projects like that. Then the other thing is that countries can use this on a macro level, depending on the remittances they're getting in, that can improve their trade status based on the foreign exchange that is coming in. So remittances are now finally, this sort of lost flow are finally being used in more creative ways. And I think there's a lot of potential there for any of you that are interested in that. Let me move on to, let's see. I'm going to just flip through some of these so we have enough time for questions. This is just, I want you just to see this because this is what I've been talking about in terms of, this is the traditional measure, ODA, is the government aid, as a percentage of GNI and in billions. And if you look at the chart on the right, and the top number there, it's hard to see, is 30 billion. And the United States gives the most foreign aid, government aid, in terms of the absolute number. And on the chart on the left, when you take it as a percent of our gross national income, you can see that the United States is at the bottom. We're like 5th from the bottom. But in Governor Romney's speech yesterday, when he talked about that our government aid is 2 times greater than any other country, these are the numbers he's using. Because as you can see, our 30 billion is greater than the United Kingdom at 13 billion, and Germany, and so forth. And it's also almost 1/4 of what the total amount is of 128 billion. So that's what he's talking about. And he's just trying to put in perspective that even though we're small as a percent of GNI, we're still giving a huge amount overseas. So I will then go to this and move ahead. So if you take all of our, this is just sort of a fun chart. If you use the measure that I think should be used, if you're going to compare countries on their generosity, if that's your goal, then I'm saying you should really take not just ODA, but you should look at ODA and philanthropy and remittances, because these are all forms of giving. They're all forms of financial flows that we know are reducing poverty. And when you do that, as that blue line is the measure, or the chart on the left is the measure of our government aid as a percent of our GNI. So if you take the other measures and put them in, it moves the United States up to the middle, it moves Canada up to the top, and it moves the United Kingdom up as well. And that's partially because we have a greater tradition of philanthropy in the UK and Canada and the US, and we also have greater migration and greater remittances. So that is just a chart that I usually get asked about. Okay, what's going on out there? What are the new? What's the new landscape? Cause-related marketing. That's Product Red. That's Tom's Shoes. That's when you buy your Starbucks coffee, if anybody drinks that here, or not. Probably not. When you don't buy it, you buy Tom's Shoes at least. Okay, and MAC Cosmetics. Okay, there we go. A lot of that, a lot of percentage of that will go to HIV/AIDS, especially in Africa. E-philanthropy and mobile phones. You've heard of Kiva, Global Giving, and Facebook and eBay philanthropy programs. And what's interesting about e-philanthropy is just the speed with which it's given, and the 10% transaction cost compared to like the 100% overhead that most contractors working with U.S. government funds will spend, and the people-to-people nature of internet giving with a lot of these interesting programs, which has led to the phrase of the democratization of philanthropy. And as Dennis Whittle, who used to head up Global Giving, calls it, he says, now we have ordinary Oprahs throughout the United States. So financial and mobile phones, of course, if you're reading up on this topic, have just revolutionized financial services for the poor. It's banking the unbankable. But the project, we write about them in our past indexes if you want to see these amazing programs where a farmer can go buy seeds with his mobile phone and the bank account that he has on that, and because Visa is involved with this program, and he pays a little bit extra, and it gives him crop insurance. He buys that crop insurance. He immediately gets his policy number he sees on his mobile phone. And then the Kenya Department of Weather is monitoring the area where he's planting his crops. They will send him an automatic payment for his crop insurance if there's a drought and they don't get any payment. And I was trying to think if any of my insurance programs, any of yours work that well or that easily. So there's just some very exciting things where they're skipping over some of the usual bureaucracy in our programs. Public-private partnerships are very common in multilateral institutions now. They weren't 15 years ago. They're a big deal. Remittances I told you about. Now, the new financial mechanisms, I'm not going to dwell on this a long time, but if you want to stay on top of things, it isn't just philanthropy now. It isn't just social entrepreneurship. It is the circle on the left, socially responsible investing, socially screened investing, which will invest in companies that have good environmental or labor standards. The U.S. institution there, TIAA-CREF, has a program like that. There's now $500 billion in funds that's working around the world in developing countries. Below that is impact investing, mission-related investment. These are investments that will generate both a social and a financial return. There's a group called Microvest, which invests in like hundreds of microcredit institutions so that they can lend to thousands of people. The top right, program-related investing, whole new programs that foundations do where they don't have to make a profit, but they can, and they will invest in an area that they have programs in. And so one program is Rockefeller is giving loans to a Ugandan bank, which is then lending those to microfinance organizations in Uganda. Social stock exchanges are stock exchanges that are investing in what they will deem are socially responsible investments. So there is a whole new world out there, which is really, when you think about it, this is beyond philanthropy. It's sort of the end of definitions because, for example, with social enterprises, this is nonprofits creating for-profit ventures, or it's for-profit ventures creating nonprofit. It's really an end of definitions in what philanthropy is, what foreign aid is. And so I did a article in the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs where we get into this in a lot more depth if you're kind of interested in that. But if I were a young person, I would be looking not at just the traditional social entrepreneurship projects, but at some of these new vehicles that are out there because they're very exciting. The big picture, the trends in global private assessment on the left is what it was and often still is in government aid, donors and recipients versus partnerships today, top-down planning versus a democratization of voice. All about the dollars, and by that I mean the exit strategy with the traditional government and even some NGO projects is, okay, here's what we did, now write me another check. Well, not with the new philanthropists, or certainly not with the new billionaires, or with some of these new mechanisms. It's all about engaged leadership, where people get involved, and they're working to solve the problem, not just get the next check to continue. So it's very hands-on. Corporate social responsibility is actually, yes, it'll always be there, but the new concept that companies are doing is shared value. And what does that mean? That means that they're saying, hey, we're just not going to write a check for you. We want to get involved with this project. We want to bring the expertise of our company in supply chain management, in information technology, to the problem you're trying to solve and make it work. And in this year's index, we write a lot about this. Hewlett-Packard, Walmart, Coca-Cola are doing this, and we have a whole big section on it if you want to learn more about this. And then the final trend that we see is it's a loyalty to the old school is loyalty to institutions. I'm only going to write that check to care or save the children, to the loyalty to fixing the problems. The new entrepreneurs, the new philanthropists, new people in these financial mechanisms want to solve the problem. They don't care if they're working with a nonprofit or a for-profit, and they may use a blend of that. Or if they find a good government agent in a country, they're going to work with them. So I'm going to now, this is just, why don't we wait for the discussion of what this means for government, and we can talk about that. And I'll just, to end up here, just show you a couple of, these are just 6 or 7 groups that we have featured out of like hundreds that we write about in our index and that you know about as well. 5 Talents, Global Giving, Hagar International, an amazing program for human rights where they have taken women out of these brothels and given them jobs. The Global Giving, which I mentioned. Kickstart, have you heard of Martin Fisher and Kickstart in Kenya? Amazing project. He was sort of a disaffected World Bank employee and went and designed an amazing irrigation system and is now, I want to just go back to that, but well, I can't go back. Anyway, wonderful project in Africa. Endeavor is another interesting organization, and TechnoServe is the one that I mentioned to you too. This is just to give you an idea of what we try to do, in our index, if it can be helpful to you as you grow and learn in this field. We really do a lot of due diligence on organizations that we think, one, are having results that are demand-driven, that are sustainable. We have our criteria of what should happen in development aid, whether it's public or private. And just to give you an idea of what some of these are, and you probably have a whole ream of them that you know that we probably haven't even covered. And we're always looking for good examples too, if you are researching or being involved in some of these. So I will stop there, and hopefully we have close to 10 minutes or so for questions.
So you know the routine. Raise your hand, we'll bring the mic to you. Tell us what you're studying. Tell us your name, what you're studying so we know who you are. Please just wait for the mic.
Hi, Melena Warden. I'm studying anthropology, and I was just wondering, I'm looking into going into social entrepreneurship, and you had mentioned looking into some of those other fields or those other areas. I was wondering what you would recommend to do research to see, just get a different perspective and not just philanthropy or social entrepreneurship.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I would go in, as I'm thinking about that, I'd look at what some of these foundations have done in their program-related investing, where they're trying to have, they're looking for, hey, let's see if we can have a profit, but let's make sure we can do social good. And a lot of the big foundations are doing that, Rockefeller, MacArthur, Ford. I'd also look at some of these groups that are doing the impact investing and mission-relating investing. And we give names of those in this piece I did for the Georgetown Journal. And one is called Leapfrog, another is called Microvest, and there's just a ton of them out there. So I would look at some of those, because I think you will be, as an anthropologist or someone that is interested in that field, you'll be amazed at how it's helping people at the grassroots. In fact, one project by Mercy Corps, a traditional NGO, is in Indonesia, and they had been trying to give nutrition supplements to these poor women in Indonesia, and just kept doing same thing, writing the check to give them the same nutrition supplement. Well, they changed it. They changed their thing. They now have trained these women to have food carts that sell nutritional food. They've got a micro loan program up. Saatchi & Saatchi came in and did a big advertising campaign. And now these women are making money, and they're selling food at the same price, nutritious food at the same price. That's the future. And anthropologists should love that future. And we feature that program in Indonesia in this year's index, if you want to read about that.
Hi, my name is Clayton. I'm studying political science. I just want to know, from your research and all you know about this, what do you see the trend happening in the future for government aid versus private aid, and which would you promote? Like, would you think that would be better for the overall philanthropy efforts that we have less government aid and more coming from private, or what is your view on that?
Good, I'm glad you asked, because that was a slide I slipped over. I think we have to have a complete new government foreign aid model, okay? And honestly, this is Secretary Clinton has been saying this too, and Raj Shah in the current administration. I've been really on board with everything they've been doing. And because they're recognizing that the government aid is now a minority shareholder, and it isn't, you know, putting the majority of funds in, and it isn't creating the, you know, the economic growth. So then what is its role? And they have said, in addition to even Governor Romney's speech where he talked about government aid leveraging private work. So my feeling is that government, the U.S. government in particular, should work more like aid program should work like a foundation. It should be in the business of, you can pick an area, you know, freedom, democracy, human rights, healthcare, fine, whatever area they want to pick. But then they should be in the business of soliciting ideas from all over the world, not deciding what they want to do, but seeing what is working already out there through private philanthropy and letting those groups come in and, you know, make a case for money that they might want to scale up a successful program in a country, or to help them do something that they maybe had trouble raising funds for. So I see, you know, that the role of the government more as a foundation. Yes, government's always going to have to be involved in humanitarian and conflict areas and refugees and all of that. We are, and when we have strategic issues, if our you know, resources are threatened, but government should serve more as a convener of resources, a facilitator, rather than being in the business of deciding what countries need. And they should be working with civil society much more than, you know, than governments, than they do now. Yeah.
My name is Colleen McDermott, and I'm an anthropology major. And I just had a question. What are you, how do you feel about the organization One, the One campaign?
Yes, in fact, I don't know them real well, but they're doing a lot of advocacy, right? And I am less interested in advocacy work because I'm more interested in actual, if I'm going to put time and money into something, I'd rather see a program rather than lobbying somebody for money. I mean, I do agree that a certain amount of advocacy is important if you want to, you have to get your message out for anything you do. So I would probably not be involved with them. But I don't think they're doing any great harm in the world or anything. And I'm sure they probably raised some money for some good projects.
Hi, my name's Jenna, and I'm studying international relations. A point that a lot of people bring up about foreign aid by governments and even about NGOs is that in developing countries where there's a lot of corruption, it's hard to get the aid to the people. Would you say that the private sector is more successful in kind of skirting the corruption and getting it to where it actually needs to go?
Yes, I think we can say that. I mean, first of all, private sector aid by definition rarely goes to governments, okay? So it's usually always going to a private foundation or to a private NGO. It's also one thing we know for sure, and I can't say anything about results because private aid does not a good job at measuring their outcomes. They don't do any better than government aid, but they deliver it more efficiently. They have lower overheads, and you know, because we've done studies on this with what a big contractor does with government aid money, and it's much less. I think because they give smaller amounts of money and they have boards of people who are involved and interested and follow it, that they will follow results more in general. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't some bad apples in the, in the NGO basket as well. So that's another story. And there certainly are, but I think overall, I think they do a better job on that smaller scale level.
Hey, my name is Riley Andresen, and I'm studying anthropology and international development. And for me, I've noticed that when I tell people like international development, they often think Africa. But is there a place in the world that you consider that needs just as much help, but that is kind of overlooked?
Well, yeah, certainly in South Asia, you know, there and places like Burma, now that it's opening up, and South Asia, Bangladesh, and obviously areas in India, you know, definitely have lots of poor people. But I think that even in these countries that are considered poor, you still have, you know, in poor regions, you're still going to have high net worth individuals and people of wealth in these countries and a middle class who are starting their own foundations. And to me, to the extent that you can work with these local foundations and in helping strengthen them, strengthen local institutions, that's in any country, that's where you need to be. Okay.
My name is Davy Johnson. I'm studying public health. I was interested in the social entrepreneurship that you mentioned. I was wondering what advice you would give someone interested in that field. Since it is pretty new, there's not a ton of advice given to those individuals. What would you say?
Okay, well, this it's dear to my heart, and here's where I would go in public health. One, I would be focusing on chronic diseases, because, you know, talk about lack of research or clarity on what's going on. I mean, cancers cause more deaths in the developing world than HIV, TB, malaria combined. And heart attacks and all those, and diabetes now are huge problems. And they're much more expensive than the smaller amount of cost of interventions for even maternal child health and that. So there's just a revolution that needs to happen there in chronic diseases. So I would look at that. And I would say I would look at our own U.S. nonprofit healthcare models. And there's a very interesting group in Nigeria called Hygeia, and it's and the Danish development company funded it. And first of all, there's a lot of money even in poor countries for healthcare. Over half the healthcare dollar is private money in Africa, and this is a World Bank statistic. Okay, it's from people's private funds, so it's there. It's just that it's very difficult for an African to find an HMO or an insurance system available to use so that they could pay an affordable premium and get a good service. And because the government healthcare systems are not good yet. So this Hygeia was an HMO where they went into a poor area and they had the people pay premiums, affordable premiums, and they brought in doctors that actually then serviced them. And then they got contracts with the government to be able to provide better services to the government. So, you know, they're a nonprofit, so, you know, they're not making huge, you know, profit margins off of it, but it is at least providing in this a big area now in Nigeria. And to me, that would be the answer if I were in. And then they're dealing with chronic diseases, you know, because that's been totally ignored. AID does virtually nothing in chronic diseases, and it is crippling these countries in people's productive ages, because, you know, the cancers and heart disease are creating a huge drain on these governments' pension systems, disability systems, lost days of work, much higher than the hospitalization costs of heart disease and all of that. So that, you know, that would be my advice in health. Very different from what's happening today. Sure, yes, thank you very much. And I'm here if you have any more questions afterwards.